In this video, we're going to finish up looking at the controls that you can actually place on your web page in a form. The first one we're going to look at, beyond the text boxes that we looked at in the last video, would be a checkbox. And basically that's just either on or off. It's checked or it's not checked. When they're checked, it's on. When they're not checked, obviously they're off. They toggle between the on and off positions by clicking the box. Normally they appear individually, but they can also appear as a group of checkboxes that share a control name and allow users to select several values for the same property. They're ideal for form controls when you need to allow a user to provide a simple yes or no response with one control, or to select several items from a list of possible options. You create the checkbox using the input element and set the type attribute to checkbox. So if we look at a simple example of this, you'll see that we've got our form here, and in this case we actually have several checkboxes. This allows them to select the various skills they might have as a programmer or a web programmer. Notice also that these are all sharing the same name. That puts them in a group then, and all the ones that are checked, the value of those then are sent as comma separated values. Notice also that the name starts with CHK for a checkbox. And as you can see, you can click them all if you want or leave them all blank, doesn't matter. Clicking them a second time turns it back on or off, whichever the case may be. As far as the attributes you could use type, obviously that's needed for the checkbox, the name required, as is a value, because the value that you define inside the input is what actually gets sent to the server, so that's our name value pair, and then checked. And checked merely predetermines that it's already checked when the page loads. So if you want it to be checked automatically, you would include that checked. They carry all the universal attributes. They also carry disabled, form, autofocus, and required that we talked about in the last video. Radio buttons. These are similar to checkboxes in that they are either on or off, but there's two really big differences. One is that when you have a group of radio buttons that share the same name, only one of them could be selected at a time. Now, the key there is the group and the same name. If you've already taken Visual Studio, you're probably familiar with making radio buttons and making them into a group by the container that they're in. That is not true in HTML. It's the name that groups them together. So they all have to have the same name. And then you should not use radio buttons for a single form control where the control indicates on or off, because once that radio button would be selected, you have no way of deselecting it. The only way to deselect a radio button is when there's a group of radio buttons and you select one of the other ones in the same group. Again, we're going to use the input element, the type of radio, and our prefix for the name would be RAD for radio. So if we look at this example, you see that we have 3 radio buttons. They all have the same name, making them a group. So when we work with these, once I click one, if I click a second one, the first one goes off. So you need to be very careful when setting these up that you have the correct name. A small typing error, such as leaving the S off of this one no longer has the same name as the other ones. So if we refresh the page, the first two still work the way you would expect them to, but the third one, being in and of itself with its only name that is the same, or no other ones with the same name, is can be selected also, but there's no way of deselecting it as I spoke of before. Again, just like the checkboxes, you need to type, set the radio, you need a name and value, and you could use checked if you want to pre-select it. The sample we just looked at did not pre-select one of those, but you can pre-select one using the checked. They also all carry the universal attributes, and they, just like the checkbox, they also have disabled, form, autofocus, and required. Select boxes. This is where you can create a list of items or a drop-down box with several items in it so that the user can select one item from that menu. They also provide an alternative to single line text input controls where you want to limit the options that the user can enter. So rather than having them type something in and possibly type it incorrectly, you give them the only possible choices that they have to choose from, and they choose one of them so that you don't have that problem of being typed incorrectly or misspelled or whatever the case may be. This does not use an input element, but it has its own select element. And each option then that's contained in it has its own option tag. Both the select and the option are container tags, so they have opening and closing tags, unlike the input that is a empty or self-contained tag. So you can see then we have our select box, we have our name, starts with SEL for select. I would also accept LST or CMB if you're familiar with those and you feel more familiar with those and want to use them, that's fine. What shows for the user to see is what's between the opening and closing option element or tags. So whatever's in there is what the user's going to see. Has nothing to do with what gets sent when the form is submitted. What gets sent when the form is submitted is the value. So you preset the value that's going to be set a lot of times rather than being text or numbers, but it depends on the situation, but you have a value. Notice that this very first one has a value of an empty string. This is the one that just gives instructions to select a color for them. And instead of checked like the checkbox and the radio button, you use selected if you want to pre-select one. And actually we're going to take this just to show you because the select color is the very first one. We'll take this selected and move it down to the green one. And you'll see then when we look at this in the browser that green is automatic selected. And then you would have your choices once you hit that drop down. Obviously we wouldn't want to do the selected as green because we have the select color, which is a short indication of what that user is supposed to do. Also, the width of this control is dictated by the longest text that is in between the opening and closing option tags. With CSS, you'll learn that you can control the width of this as well, but in regular HTML, the width of this is based on the longest text, as I said, between the opening and closing option tags. As with the radio button and combo box, you need a name. The name is used then in the name value pairs being sent to the server, and as I mentioned before, you can use SEL, LST, CMB. The size creates what we refer to as a list box. So the size is not how many characters will fit in it, like you saw in a text box in the last video, but it's how many items will actually show, how many will be visible at any one time. If you set it for 3 and you have 6 items, there'll be scroll bars to allow you to get to the other 3, but it'll show 3 at any one time. It also has a multiple, which is a boolean that just allows the user to select multiple items. They take all the universal attributes as well as disabled, form, autofocus, and required, as most of the ones we've been looking at do. The option element, again, between the opening and closing tags is what's actually going to display. The opening option element itself has several attributes you can use. One would be the value that you definitely want to put in there. So what's going to be sent to the server for processing. Selected as you just saw so that it pre-selects a specific one. A label, which is an alternative way of labeling options. It uses the attribute then rather than the element content. So if you put a label in option, that's what would display as opposed to what's between the opening and closing tags. Disabled, it's a Boolean. It's either disabled or it's not, true or false. That disables the select box, preventing user intervention. To create scrolling select boxes, as I said before, you would use the size attribute to set how many options you want to be visible at any one time. You can see in this example we have 7 days of the week, but we set the size for 4. So it's only going to show 4 days at any one time, even though there's more. We launch this in browser. You can see that we have our 4 days, and we have the scroll bar that I talked about earlier to be able to look at the other ones. With the multiple that I talked about, again, it allows you to select more than one item from the select box. But if you do that, you might want to give a hint somewhere of how to do that. Not everybody knows that holding a control and clicking actually selects it. You know that. You've been around computers enough, but not everybody that uses computers necessarily knows that. So you want to make that known of how they could actually do that. When using this also, it automatically makes the select box look like a list box or a scrolling select box, if you would. Notice that we have no size in here. We just have the multiple. We have our same 7 days of the week, but when we run this, it still shows 4. That's just a normal. That's the way it's going to do automatically. Then you can choose one, hold the control key, and choose another. Another example of doing this would be if you were using a select box to choose maybe toppings for a pizza. There are also an option for grouping certain items in that select list together. You do that with the group element. It acts like a container element for all the elements you want within that. It has an opening and closing tag, and then everything between the opening and closing tag become part of that group. It automatically indents what's below them or what's in that group. It indents them slightly from the group header itself. It must carry a label attribute. That label attribute is the value that is going to display for the group of options. Different browsers display option group elements in slightly different ways, so you might want to check to make sure that it looks the way you want in all the different browsers, but it still separates them into logical groups, if you would. You can see here we have 3 option groups. First one is for hardware, desktop computers, laptop computers. The label is what's going to display. The desktop and laptop are going to be indented. The second one we have is for software, and then the third one is for peripherals. So if we take a look at this one, when we actually get to the drop-down list, you can see this is Firefox, so hardware, software, and peripherals are bold, italicized, and then everything that is part of them is indented. Notice also that as I scroll over these, I cannot select those. I've got my mouse right on top of peripherals and it won't let me select it, but as soon as I move it a little bit lower, I can get the monitors. Attributes for select boxes can be disabled, form, size, multiple, required, autofocus. all the universal attributes that we talked about. And then for the option, you could use the label, and you saw that being used when we have the option group selected, value, and disabled, as well as all the universal attributes. You can also use a select box to upload a file to your website from the user's computer. It's created using the input element with the type of the attribute having the value of file. The encryption type attribute is added to the form element with a value of multi-part / form data, so that each form control is sent separately to the server. This is required on a form that uses a file upload box. The accept attribute is added to the input element to indicate the MIME type of file that can be selected for upload. This attribute is currently supported only by Opera 11 and up, Chrome 16 and up, Firefox 9 and up, and Internet Explorer 10 and up. An input element whose type attribute has the value of file can also take name, obviously it's going to have a name, disabled, form, accept, autofocus, required, and multiple. So you can see in here on our form we have the encryption type, which is multi-port form data, and then in the input we gave it a file and we told it that it would accept anything that is an image, any type of image whatsoever. Now the nice thing about this is that when you do display this, it automatically gives you a browse button, which automatically then opens up your files, your file explorer on your computer. So you can then just go to search for whatever file it is that you want to put in there. Hidden controls. Hidden controls are used to pass information between pages without users seeing it. You want to make sure that you don't use this for any sensitive information, because a quick view source would show what that data actually is. It would show the value of that hidden element. So you don't want to do anything that's sensitive, but you may want to pass things from one form to another, especially if you've got some type of input form where you're collecting so much information that you break it up into pages. Maybe the user's information on one page, so if they're buying something. Maybe their credit card information on the next page. Maybe the shipping information on the next page. And between all them, you might pass a order number that would be created with the first submission and pass that order number on to the other ones until you're done. That's just one example. Or it could be a user's name. Once they log in, they like to be called Pat, so you pass Pat from page to page so that you can personalize the page that they're on. So it could be any number of things, but it's hidden to the user himself. You can see here that we have the hidden one. It has a type, which is hidden, the name, we usually start with HID, and a value. The value is what's actually going to be passed from page to page. And as I said before, when you do a view source, that value is clearly there, so you don't want to use anything that is sensitive in any way, so that they can actually see something that they shouldn't be able to see. So in addition to the new input types that we've looked at so far, the new HTML5 specification added several completely new form elements as well. We'll take a look at a couple of these, and the first one would be the progress element. With this, you can track completion of a task and let the user know how far along they are in it. It's designed to represent the progress through a task. It makes use of two attributes to craft a display: the max, which indicates the maximum value of the progress element, and a value, which is the amount that's been completed. If you do not have a value entered, the rendering of the element changes from a determinate progress element to one that's indeterminate. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at an example. See, we've got our form, and here's our progress. It has a value of 6 and a max of 13. So with a value and a max value, you get something that looks like this. Well, if we take that value out, save it, and refresh it, we don't get a set value, but if you look at this, you can see that there's a white part that kind of scrolls along as if it's working even as we speak. So it's not giving you the actual progress, but it's showing progress in the fact that that line is moving, which is one of the ways a lot of people do display progress. There is also a meter that represents a scalar measurement within a range. The meter element enables you to display a gauge, if you would. It accepts the following attributes: high, which specifies the low end of the high range, and low, which specifies the high end of the low range. And then the ones you're more commonly going to see: max, which is the maximum range; min, the minimum range; the optimum, which represents the optimal numeric value; and the value, which specifies how much of the task has actually been completed. So you can see in the example here, we've got a meter. It's got a minimum of 0, maximum of 590, value of 510. When we look at this in a browser, you can see what we get with that. We're currently using 510 megabytes out of 950. When you're doing this, this probably is going to be controlled, or the value of this is probably going to be changed through some JavaScript at some point in order to get this to change. The same may happen for the progress, where you're running something, you're running a JavaScript alongside, and you're telling it, okay, it's time to change this to this value, change it to this value, change it to this value. We talked about using a data list earlier with the autocomplete. So with any input, you can add in the new data list element. This data list enables you to pair the flexibility to have a plain text entry field with a list of pre-populated options available for the user to choose from. You pair the data list element with a series of nested option elements. Now, you wouldn't have the select element with these, they would just be option elements inside of the data list. So option can be used for the select, as you've seen, and now you're going to see the option element used with a data list. These options directly populate a list of options that narrow down as the user types. The value of the list attribute in the input element is the value of the ID attribute of the data list element. So you can see here that we have just a plain text input. We have a data list that has an ID of tech, and it's got CSS, HTML, JavaScript, and it also adds the new list attribute, and it's set to tech, which is the ID of the data list. So in a browser, when you start typing in here, it starts showing you things that you can choose from. Now you could still enter something totally different. If nothing matches it, it just lets you enter it. So unlike the select list where you have to choose one of the ones that were in the list, with this one you don't have to. You could type something else in, but if you do start typing, it'll show you the ones that could possibly match what you're putting in. And then all you'd have to do is click on it and it would be chosen. So that takes care of all the controls that we're going to talk about. In the last video for this chapter, we're going to look at some supporting things dealing with the form, and such as labels, and some other ways of working with some other attributes actually that help the user work through your actual form.